Did Yahweh condone, approve of, and order child sacrifice? Such a possibility seems anathema to the character of the omnibenevolent God of the created order. And yet, the Old Testament records multiple unambiguous cases of Yahweh doing just that. In this video, we survey the dark side of Scripture and uncover Yahweh's desire to satiate his need for sacrifice with the firstborn sons of Israel. One of the most significant contributors to my deconversion from the Christian faith was undoubtedly the senseless barbarism in the Old Testament that ran counter to my moral sensibilities. Genocide, infanticide, slavery, and misogyny all laid at the feet of Yahweh throughout the Hebrew Bible. And while all these respective issues had largely unpersuasive rationalizations from my go-to Christian apologists at the time, there remained other problems in Scripture just as pressing that I felt were almost never addressed at all. One of these issues, which is obviously the topic of the video, was the notion of child sacrifice. It appears to not be common knowledge among your average Christian, but child sacrifice as endorsed and ordered by Yahweh himself is peppered throughout the Old Testament. Most Christians know of the story of Abraham and Isaac, but since Abraham never actually follows through with his sacrifice of Isaac, the immoral implications of the story are usually not given a second thought. And yet, while we will indeed survey the story of Abraham and Isaac in this video, that infamous pericope barely scratches the surface of the depraved behavior of Yahweh with regards to his relation to and condonement of child sacrifice as depicted in the Hebrew Bible. Let's begin our reluctant examination of the evidence by surveying a passage in Exodus chapter 22. During this chapter of Exodus, the Ten Commandments have just been given, and now a second body of civil and moral statutes or laws are revealed by Yahweh as part of the, quote, Book of the Covenant. As part of these laws, we read the following in verses 29 and 30. You shall not delay to make offerings from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. 7 days it shall remain with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. In case the ostensible context is not clear, Israel is to give thanks to Yahweh, made in the form of offerings. And these offerings concern first fruits, whether of the harvest or of the womb. The firstborn sons of Israel are to be sacrificed to Yahweh, just as the firstborn clean animals, i.e. oxen and sheep, are likewise to be sacrificed. Reading the text in this way seems natural, especially given the clause, you shall do the same, which is also sometimes translated as in the same manner. That is to say, in the same manner of which the firstborn oxen and sheep are to be sacrificed to Yahweh is the same manner in which the firstborn children of Israel are to be sacrificed. Now, before any Christians watching this begin shaking their head, I will be transparent and acknowledge that the reading and interpretation I have provided for these verses is not agreed upon, even by critical scholars. Many scholars believe that verses 29 and 30 unequivocally reference child sacrifice, and yet many other scholars believe that this is not the case. However, these verses in chapter 22 need not stand alone, nor should they, for one need only read a bit further in the book of Exodus to gain clarifying perspective on exactly what Yahweh supposedly had in mind regarding the role of the firstborn sons as an offering. So let us turn to Exodus chapter 34, where Yahweh restores his covenant with Israel after the golden calf incident and subsequently articulates more of his laws and moral statutes. In verses 19 and 20, we read, All that first opens the womb is mine, all your male livestock, the firstborn of cow and sheep. The firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with the lamb, or if you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. All the firstborn of your sons you shall redeem. No one shall appear before me empty-handed. Now, an apologist might read these verses and say, you see, Yahweh never intended for the firstborn to actually be sacrificed. They were to be redeemed or ransomed by a substitute animal sacrifice. but not so fast. As scholar Tom Stark notes in his book, The Human Faces of God, quote, "The logic of the requirement of the firstborn is not repudiated in chapter 34, verse 20. Yahweh still demands the blood of the firstborn, but is willing to accept an animal's substitution as satiation. This is more significant than we think. If human sacrifice is abhorrent to Yahweh, why does Yahweh not simply say so? Yahweh does not say, 'I am not like other gods. I do not demand the blood of your firstborn sons.' On the contrary, Yahweh does indeed demand their blood, but is willing to accept a lesser sacrifice in their stead. The logic of human sacrifice is not repudiated here, but sustained." So, the hermeneutical gymnastics that apologists employ seem to be unpersuasive, at least to me. Exodus appears to paint a picture of Yahweh that is consistent with his acceptance of child sacrifice. And I'm not alone in making this inference. The prophet Ezekiel seems to believe unequivocally that Yahweh accepted these sacrifices as well. In fact, according to Ezekiel, not only did Yahweh accept these sacrifices, but the laws that he promulgated that led to these sacrifices being offered were apparently admitted by Yahweh himself to be immoral and corrupt. Ezekiel transmits Yahweh's supposed thoughts in chapter 20, verses 19 through 26. "I, the Lord, am your God. Follow my statutes. Be careful to observe my ordinances, and hallow my Sabbaths, that they may be a sign between me and you, so that you may know that I, the Lord, am your God. But the children rebelled against me. They did not follow my statutes, and were not careful to observe my ordinances, by whose observance everyone shall live. They profaned my Sabbaths. Then I thought I would pour out my wrath upon them and spend my anger against them in the wilderness. But I withheld my hand and acted for the sake of my name, so that it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations, in whose sight I had brought them out. Moreover, I swore to them in the wilderness that I would scatter them among the nations and disperse them through the countries, because they had not executed my ordinances, but had rejected my statutes and profaned my Sabbaths, and their eyes were set on their ancestors' idols. Moreover, I gave them laws that were not good, and rules by which they could not live. I defiled them through their very gifts, in their offering up all their firstborn, in order that I might make them desolate, so that they might know that I am the Lord." Wow. Even if one were to claim that this passage in Ezekiel doesn't pertain to child sacrifice, they'd have to, at the very least, admit that it paints a picture of Yahweh that is barbaric, primitive, and unworthy of praise or worship. A God who feels the need to shock his chosen people through horror and atrocity with the end goal of merely making them aware of his superiority and ultimacy is nothing more than a primitive and barbaric ancient Near Eastern mythological deity. Nevertheless, putting all that aside and zeroing in on the specifics of Yahweh's supposed pronouncements, what we have here is horrifying indeed. Yahweh admits that he intentionally gave the Israelites laws and statutes that were not moral and were not geared towards their well-being. Not only was the well-being of the Israelites not at all Yahweh's end goal, his purpose and intent was, rather, to make them desolate, i.e., to make them without firstborn successors. And how does Yahweh go about attempting to achieve this goal? Does he just barbarically wipe out the firstborn Israelites himself wholesale, as he supposedly did in Egypt during the Passover? No, he doesn't, though this action is clearly not beneath him. Or does he instead have another ancient Near Eastern tribe do his dirty work for him and have them brutally reduce the Israelites to naught? Not in this instance, no. Instead, Ezekiel paints an even more atrocious picture. According to Ezekiel, the avenue that Yahweh takes to achieve the desolation of the Israelites was to have the Israelites themselves offer up their firstborn sons as burnt offerings and sacrifices. Now, obviously, the straightforward interpretation of verses such as this will not be upheld by Christians. Some apologists have claimed that Ezekiel chapter 20 doesn't really mean that God gave the Israelites immoral laws, but rather gave them over to immoral laws. In fact, some Bible translations explicitly word the verse that way. The issue here is that the Hebrew word natan in verse 25 simply means to give, and the indirect object of the sentence is them, i.e., the Israelites. So the plain reading of the text is indeed that Yahweh himself gave these immoral laws and ordinances to the Israelites. Also, to anyone who reads the entirety of Ezekiel 20, they'll notice that Yahweh states multiple times that he originally gave the Israelites laws and statutes that were good and by which they should live. It wasn't until the Israelites disobeyed and rebelled against Yahweh continuously that, according to Ezekiel, Yahweh apparently became fed up and gave them laws and statutes that weren't good and would defile them and make them desolate. The point here is that the notion of Yahweh giving the Israelites these laws and statutes are the same in each case. If Yahweh originally gave moral laws and statutes, then he later also gave immoral laws and statutes, on pain of equivocation. Now, other apologists will claim that the passage doesn't explicitly pertain to child sacrifice, but could and should instead be read as Yahweh merely ordering up all the firstborn animals as sacrifices. Now, while this reading might seem somewhat plausible at first glance, since only the word firstborn is explicitly mentioned in verse 26, and we know that the Israelites constantly offered sacrifices of firstborn animals to Yahweh, this reading ultimately doesn't cut it. Firstly, it doesn't really make sense that Yahweh would seek to make the Israelites desolate through the offerings that they were already making. Keep in mind that the offering up of firstborn animals was already practiced as an ideal and moral law promulgated by Yahweh. It was never envisioned as a practice that would lead to the desolation of the Israelites, quite the opposite. Also, how exactly would this defile the Israelites, as this passage in Ezekiel claims, since firstborn animal sacrifices were the exact opposite of defilement? The practice of sacrificing the firstborn male of the clean animals was a practice meant to sanctify and consecrate the Israelites, as well as remind them of the Passover wherein they were supposedly mercifully spared. None of this makes sense if the reading of Ezekiel 22 intends to communicate that sacrificing the firstborn animals was commanded with the intention of defiling the Israelites. So again, the plain, straightforward, and most sensical reading of this passage entails that Yahweh, due to the Israelites' unfaithfulness, purposefully ordered that they participate in the human sacrifice of their firstborns. Not only is this passage in Ezekiel horrifying in and of itself, but since Ezekiel, as Yahweh's mouthpiece, is referencing events that took place during the book of Exodus, it appears plausible that my earlier remarks regarding those passages in chapters 22 and 34 are well-founded. Child sacrifice was likely present as far back as the book of Exodus records, and Ezekiel's horrifying passages are most likely his way of rationalizing the barbaric and shocking practices that he himself knew had taken place among his Israelite forebears. Now, despite the shocking passages we've surveyed, there remain even more to examine. Let's leave Ezekiel and turn to a well-known story in Judges chapter 11 regarding Jephthah, the warrior and leader of Gilead. The relevant part of the story in Judges chapter 11 goes like this. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon Jephthah, and he makes a vow to Yahweh that if he will make Jephthah victorious in battle over the Ammonites, then Jephthah vows to sacrifice as a burnt offering that which first comes out of his house to greet him in his victorious return. Ostensibly, Yahweh accepts this vow with apparently no trace of divine foreknowledge on his part. As one would expect, Jephthah emerges victorious over the Ammonites due to the divine favor of Yahweh. And as it would happen, Jephthah returns home to be greeted by none other than his only child, his daughter. Upon seeing his daughter greet him, he tears his clothes and immediately laments. Nevertheless, through the persuasion of his own daughter, Jephthah remains faithful to his word, goes through with his vow, and sacrifices his daughter. Now, obviously, there are some immediate and important differences between this pericope and the passages we've already surveyed. In this pericope regarding Jephthah's vow, Yahweh is not the immediate catalyst nor the proximate source for the human sacrifice that takes place. That is to say, Yahweh himself does not order any human sacrifice here. Nevertheless, Yahweh is not blameless in this pericope, and not by a long shot. First, the text makes clear that the Spirit of the Lord was upon Jephthah. So, how exactly is Yahweh blameless when his own spirit, in some sense, was a cause of Jephthah's spiritual disposition in making the vow? Surely, when the Spirit of the Lord is influencing an individual and they subsequently have irrational and immoral inclinations, the Spirit is blameworthy in some sense. Second, Yahweh makes no repudiation of either the vow itself or of the human sacrifice. In fact, not only does Yahweh never disavow Jephthah's actions, but Scripture itself in Hebrews chapter 11 upholds Jephthah as an exemplification of faithfulness. So neither Yahweh nor his Spirit seems to communicate any sort of trepidation or repudiation of Jephthah sacrificing his own daughter as a burnt offering. Third, and most importantly, what's even more worrisome than Yahweh failing to shine a negative light on Jephthah's actions is Yahweh actively allowing and accepting the sacrifice on his behalf. See, it's one thing for Yahweh to sit back and merely allow the Israelites to offer human sacrifices to idols, but it's another thing entirely when human sacrifices are being offered to Yahweh specifically, and he, number one, does not explicitly repudiate the action itself, and number two, allows the barbaric action to be carried out on behalf of his name. This makes Yahweh compliant and acquiescent to the act itself, and it paints the picture of a God that is no better than the pagan deities of the ancient Near East. Yahweh is no better than Molech. Now, the story of Jephthah is a story that most apologists are silent on. After all, the blame is supposedly placed at the feet of Jephthah, not Yahweh. However, we've already surveyed how Yahweh's hands are anything but clean in this religious transaction. A God who sits idly by and allows young girls to be sacrificed as burnt offerings in his name and to him specifically is just as culpable as the person who made the rash vow. Now, one way, and really the only way, that apologists have attempted to downplay the severity of the passage is to claim that the meaning of the text does not explicitly entail that Jephthah sacrificed his daughter as a burnt offering. As the rationalization goes, an alternate and supposedly plausible interpretation can be made such that Jephthah offered his daughter up to a lifetime of temple service, i.e., she could never marry and would remain celibate in service of and faithfulness to Yahweh for the rest of her life. Unfortunately, this interpretation doesn't work. The text is unambiguous that Jephthah says, "Whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return victorious from the Ammonites, shall be the Lord's, to be offered up by me as a burnt offering." And the text continues that at the end of 2 months, she returned to her father, who did with her according to the vow he made. As scholar John J. Collins notes in his Introduction to the Hebrew Bible, there is no doubt in the context that human sacrifice is meant. The text is unambiguous that Jephthah did with her according to the vow that he had made. Jephthah is often criticized for making a rash vow, but this criticism is not made in the text, where he appears to act under the influence of the Spirit of the Lord. Neither is he condemned in the tradition. In the New Testament, he is celebrated as a hero of faith. What we have then in Judges chapter 11 is a clear case of Yahweh's Spirit influencing one of his servants in an act that Yahweh knows will lead to human sacrifice on his behalf. And given this knowledge, Yahweh firstly allows his Spirit to influence the vow being made anyway, secondly allows Jephthah to defeat the Ammonites, thereby fulfilling the antecedent condition of the vow that would lead to human sacrifice, and thirdly allows the human sacrifice as a burnt offering to be carried out in his name, all the while failing to repudiate any of this. What we've seen so far, then, entails that Yahweh is certainly no stranger to the notion of human sacrifice. He's ordered it, condoned it, and accepted it. But we're not finished. Leaving the story of Jephthah behind, let us turn to one of the most well-known pericopes in all of Scripture, the story of Abraham and Isaac. The passage in Genesis chapter 22 is as familiar as any other. Abraham is instructed by the Lord himself to take his son Isaac and offer him up as a sacrifice. So Abraham obeys and takes Isaac up to the place God instructed him. He builds an altar, binds Isaac on the altar, and just as Abraham is about to murder his son, the angel of the Lord calls to him and admonishes him to stop the sacrifice. Abraham subsequently learns that he has been faithful and has passed the test of loyalty to Yahweh. Now, here we have as clear an account as can be found of God actively commanding child sacrifice. There's no way around it. Yahweh unambiguously commands Abraham to sacrifice his son. This, in and of itself, is an immoral act. Christians seem to become consequentialists when reading this story and like to point out that God never intended Abraham to actually carry out the sacrifice of Isaac, and that Yahweh stepped in before the immoral act was committed. But again, the issue is not with the sacrifice that never came to pass. The issue is with the command itself. Commanding an immoral act, even if the act is never brought to fruition, is immoral. Another way to come to the realization of just how depraved Yahweh's actions are in this passage is to swap the sacrifice of Isaac with another immoral act that elicits just as visceral a reaction. Consider that instead of Yahweh commanding Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, Yahweh commanded Abraham to sexually assault Isaac. Hopefully, the moral repulsion you feel at such a command will illuminate my point. If God commanded such a disgusting act, it wouldn't at all matter if he gave his command knowing full well that he never intended it to be carried out. Nor would it make a difference if he stepped in at the last minute before the act occurred. These are all irrelevant to the act of commanding sexual assault in and of itself, let alone when this act is tied to a child. So the act of Yahweh commanding Abraham to sacrifice Isaac seems to be on dubious moral footing. Yet I believe that most Christians generally haven't contemplated this since the story is so familiar and since it's tied in some sense to Christ's supposed future sacrifice. After all, the act of sacrifice itself is so ubiquitous in Scripture that one almost becomes completely desensitized to it. Nevertheless, Christians who have reflected on the moral nature, or lack thereof, of Genesis 22 certainly have had their apologetics work cut out for them. One apologist who is up to the task is Paul Copan in his book, Is God a Moral Monster? A book which one would think shouldn't need to be written if Yahweh's behavior was so clearly morally virtuous in Scripture, but I digress. Copan has an entire chapter devoted to rationalizing Yahweh's immoral command, but here's an excerpt of one of Copan's most pathetic and unconvincing rationalizations. Quote, "So what if the facts about the world include a good God who specifically reveals himself and may issue extraordinary commands in specific, unique contexts and with morally sufficient reasons? The critic's task then is to show why Abraham, given what he knew, shouldn't obey God's command. After all, Abraham knew the outcome. Taking Isaac's life would only mean that God would resuscitate him so that God's covenant promise would be fulfilled. Yes, without God's command, which assumes covenant promises, Abraham would have been murdering his son, but that's not what we have here." This is quite a convoluted line of moral reasoning. According to Copan, it's the skeptic of the story who has a moral burden to bear. It's the critic, not the Christian, who needs to somehow demonstrate why Abraham murdering Isaac at the behest of a divine command is morally suspect. According to Copan, Abraham would have been morally justified in slitting Isaac's throat because Yahweh would bring him back to life. Apparently for Copan, brutally murdering a child isn't morally reprehensible if it can be guaranteed by God that said child is immediately resuscitated. Again, one would think it shouldn't need to be explicitly articulated, but the moral reprehensibility of ordering a child to be sacrificed is not negated by what happens after the heinous act. The command in and of itself is morally abhorrent, and this should be unambiguous. As we surveyed earlier, if Yahweh, instead of ordering the sacrifice of Isaac, instead ordered him to be sexually assaulted, no matter the events that followed such a reprehensible command, the command itself is morally sickening. The story of Abraham and Isaac is not a pericope that exemplifies ideal faith and lays down the divine plan for the future sacrifice of God's Son. No, it's barbaric, disgusting, and morally vacuous. So, Christians have a serious issue on their hands. The Old Testament paints a portrait of Yahweh that repeatedly aligns with the ancient Near Eastern practice of child sacrifice rather than unequivocally rejecting it. Apologetic attempts to explain these away fail to erase the plain textual thrust. The God of Judaism and Christianity does not categorically and universally condemn child sacrifice, but at times commands, accepts, or strategically employs it. Such depictions clash profoundly with any conception of a perfectly good, omnibenevolent deity. I ask the viewer, what's more likely? That the greatest conceivable being and perfect creator of the universe had morally sufficient reasons for employing and condoning child sacrifice? Or that the primitive Iron Age books which record these reprehensible actions are cut from the same cloth of myth, superstition, and moral barbarism that defined the unsophisticated world of the ancient Near East? I'll leave you to decide. Thanks for watching.